Welcome to the screencast Plain Language, Avoiding Wordiness. This is a graduate writing workshop from the University of Saskatchewan. My name is Heather McWhinney, and I'm Graduate Writing Help Specialist for the university. This screencast is an abridged version of a PowerPoint presentation on plain language, which you can find on the Student Learning Services website. Let's review the learning outcomes for this presentation. By the end of it, you should be able to write clearly in plain language, recognize zombie nouns and use strategies for avoiding them, and know how to edit your own wordy sentences. And here's what we're going to do in the screencast. We'll first define plain language, then we'll discuss zombie nouns and learn how to avoid them. And finally, we'll focus on 6 ways to write more plainly. But what is plain language? It is clear and precise writing with a minimum of jargon. It is writing that avoids zombie nouns, and I'll explain what these are in a minute. And sentences with short, non-abstract subjects and strong verbs. So zombie nouns, what are they? Well, a zombie noun is a noun derived from another part of speech, usually a verb, but it could also be an adjective. The writer Helen Sword calls these words zombie nouns because they cannibalize active verbs, suck the lifeblood from adjectives, and substitute abstract entities for human beings. But the best way to understand a zombie noun is to look at some examples. So in this table on the left, we have verbs. In the middle column, we have zombie nouns that are formed from those verbs. And on the right, we have zombie nouns used with other words as substitutes for the verbs. So let's have a look at affect, the verb, and an effect is the zombie noun derived from the verb affect. And then when you try to use the zombie noun as a verb, you have to add other words. So you have to add a helping verb, has, and then the zombie noun, and then a preposition. Same with the verb analyze. The zombie noun is analysis, and if you want to use the zombie noun as a verb or to substitute for a verb, then you have to add other words. You have to add does and the preposition of. And then with applies, the verb applies, the noun, zombie noun form is applicability. And so then in order to use it, applicability as a substitute for applies, you have to add has and you have to add the preposition for. Let's look at the verb contribute. The zombie noun is contribution. And again, if you want to substitute contribution for contribute, you have to add makes and you have to add to. So you can see then that you're much wordier if you use zombie nouns as a substitute for verbs. Much better to just use the verb form. On this slide, we have 2 versions of the same sentence, one of which contains zombie nouns. So I'm going to read them and I want you to identify which of these 2 sentences has zombie nouns. Version 1. Despite his understanding of the need by the university for capital funds for the improvement of its infrastructure, the Premier was resistant to an increase in the budget as a motivation to the university to increase tuition rates. And version 2, although he understood the university needed capital funds to improve its infrastructure, the Premier resisted budget increases to motivate the university to increase tuition rates. Okay, so let's have a look at version 1 compared with version 2. And you were right if you said that version 1 is the sentence with the zombie nouns. So let's just look at the difference here. So we'll take version 1 from the top. First zombie noun we come to is understanding, right? So how does version 2 handle the same idea? Okay, version 2 uses the verb understood. Let's go back to version 1. The next zombie noun we come across is need. Version 2 changes that zombie noun to the verb needed. Then we go on to, on the second line in version 1, the zombie noun improvement, that becomes the verb or the infinitive verb to improve in version 2. Then we go on and we have was resistant. Resistant isn't really a zombie noun, it's a zombie adjective actually. But notice that in the second one, that is converted to resisted. So it's much more active than the combination of the verb was and the adjective, the zombie adjective resistant. Then we have in version 1, we have an increase, the zombie noun an increase, changes to the verb increases in version 2. And in version 1, we have a motivation, zombie noun, motivation, that becomes the infinitive to motivate. And then we have, in fact, no change here, to increase as an infinitive in version 1 and the same in version 2. So you'll notice that, and hopefully you notice when I read this out loud how wordy version 1 sounds. And of course, the reason for that is the number of zombie nouns used. Not only wordy, but also difficult to concentrate on, difficult to focus on because of all those zombie nouns. Whereas you probably noticed that version 2 had a much more active feel to it because those zombie nouns have been converted to verbs. Let's have a look at 2 more sentences. And let's determine which of the 2 contains zombie nouns, which is written in plain language. Number 1, the proliferation of nominalizations in a discursive formation may be an indication of a tendency towards pomposity and abstraction. And number 2, writers who overload their sentences with nominalizations tend to sound pompous and abstract. And I should just tell you that nominalization is the official term for zombie noun. So you can see in the first sentence here we have, I think, seven zombie nouns. Proliferation comes from the verb proliferate. Nominalizations, formation, indication, tendency, pomposity, which actually is derived from the adjective pompous, and abstraction. And notice how in version 2, there's only one zombie noun that remains, the word nominalizations. And everything else has been converted to verbs. We have overload, we have tend to sound, or converted to verbs or to adjectives. We have pompous and we have abstract. And notice as well that the long, very abstract subject has now become a human being or human beings. We now have the subject writers. So for all these reasons, the fact that we have fewer zombie nouns, we have more action verbs, and that we have a human being as a subject. For all these reasons, sentence 2 is much clearer and much plainer than sentence 1. So let's move on now and talk about 6 ways to write plainly. The first is to keep abstractions as subject short and to try to characterize them, try to make them human if you can. And the second is to keep subjects and verbs close together. The third is avoid piling on abstractions, zombie nouns, and prepositions. The fourth is to use plain and simple language. The fifth is to reduce sentence length. And the sixth, to convert long single clause sentences to sentences with 2 clauses joined by a connecting word. So let's go through these now with examples. Number 1, keep abstractions as subject short. Let's look at these 2 versions of a sentence and decide which has shorter subjects and which is easier to understand. Number 1, the financial dependency of social economy enterprises on government requires that these organizations be accountable to government. Because social economy enterprises depend on government for their financing, they must be accountable to government. Okay, so you probably notice that the first sentence here, the first version, has the longer subject. It actually starts with the and it goes all the way down to a government. So it's 9 or 10 words. And that is too long, really, because you lose your reader by the time you get to the end of the subject. Now, the second version here has actually two subjects because the sentence has two clauses. Subject of the first clause is social economy enterprises. Well, that's an abstract concept, right? So it's good to have a short subject if you have an abstract subject. And then the second subject is they. The same concept as the first one. So the number one is to try to keep your abstractions, if you must use them as subjects, keep them short. Number two, keep subjects and verbs close together. Well, take a look at these two versions of the same sentence and see in which one the subject and verb are close together. The smallest of the URFs, a 207 nucleotide reading frame overlapping out of phase, the NH2 terminal portion of the ATPase subunit 6 gene has been identified as the animal equivalent of the recently discovered yeast H plus ATPase subunit 8 gene. And the second one, the smallest of the URFs is a 207 nucleotide reading frame overlapping out of phase, the NH2 terminal portion of the ATPase subunit 6 gene, URFA6L, has been identified as the animal equivalent of the recently discovered yeast H plus ATPase subunit 8 gene. Whew, both of those are difficult to read. Well, you might have noticed that the second sentence is a little easier to read. And why? Because in the first sentence, the subject and verb are separated by a phrase. Here's the subject, the smallest of the URFs. The verb is here, has been identified, and you have this long phrase in the middle. So by the time the reader gets to the verb, he or she has forgotten what the subject is. In the second one, the second version here, the sentences have been divided into two. And notice then that the subject here is the smallest of the URFs. The subject is, so there's no long phrase in the middle now. In the second one, you have the subject as URFA6L, and the verb has been identified. So again, they're close together. Much easier to read, especially when you've got a complex subject like this one. The third way to write more plainly is to avoid piling on abstractions. So read and listen to these two sentences and decide which has the greater number of abstractions. By drawing upon an analysis of policy documents in combination with semi-structured interviews, this paper highlights barriers to knowledge integration induced by the design of supportive policy instruments of information and institution building, where traditional knowledge is deprioritized in relation to scientific knowledge and notions of rationality and practicality. And that came from the abstract of an article in Polar Geography. And here's a slightly rewritten version. Using policy documents and semi-structured interviews, this paper suggests that efforts to integrate traditional knowledge into government policy have not displaced the primacy of scientific knowledge in resource management. So you can see how the second one, of course, is much easier to understand. The first one has all sorts of problems. It has way too many abstractions, too few verbs, and it's one long clause, and it's much too long. So you don't want to pile abstraction onto abstraction onto abstraction, because you'll just lose your reader, as the writer of this long sentence has done. So the fourth way to write more plainly is to use plain and simple language. Sometimes academics and students will try to use words that they assume are more difficult and perhaps more impressive. And what happens is those words just add unnecessary words to their writing. You can easily avoid using these words, use simpler terms. So here are some examples. On the left, the words and phrases to avoid. On the right, the words to use instead. As the case may be, very wordy, don't need to use it. At this point in time, same thing. You can use now or currently instead. Basically, you don't need to use. By the presence of can just be by. For the purpose of can just be to or for. Has the ability, capacity to can just be can. Has the potential to can be could. In the course of can be in or during. In the future, in the near future can just be soon or perhaps a more precise date. And here are some other terms that you can avoid. In recent years can just become recently. In the vicinity of can just be near. In order to can almost always be shortened to. In terms of, you shouldn't need to use. In view of the fact, owing to the fact, due to the fact, based on the fact, none of those need to be used. You can use because or since. It is interesting to note that, it is significant that, again, you just need to make your point without the preface. In regard to, regarding, pertaining to, in connection with. These can just be shortened to about or on very, very easily. The fact that, either use that or avoid it. And utilize, a lot of students use utilize. Why? Why not just use a simpler use? The fifth way to write more plainly is to reduce the length of your sentences. And often sentences contain needless words. So here's an example. The first one has too many words. The second version is much more concise. Vibration measurements made in the course of the missile's flight test program were complicated by the presence of intense high-frequency excitation of the vehicle's shell structure during the re-entry phase of the flight. And the revised version, vibration measurements made during the missile's flight were complicated by intense high-frequency excitation of the vehicle shells during re-entry. You can see that a lot of excess words have been taken out here or changed. So in the course of becomes during. Test program is gone. The writer figured it wasn't necessary. By the presence of is gone. Just by is in its place. And shell structure becomes shells. And phase of the flight is gone because it's clear that this is a flight. So you can see that just in making those changes, we've actually reduced the length of the sentence by almost a line. Another way you could reduce the length of your sentences is to convert a long sentence to several shorter sentences. So here is an example. Here's the weak version. Emerging and critical sustainability challenges associated with the management of socio-ecological systems now require holistic comprehension of the interplay of systemic interactions and adaptive strategies that ensure the resilience of the system to endogenous and exogenous factors. And the reduced and simplified version, managers of socio-ecological systems are facing critical sustainability challenges. To maintain resilient systems, decision makers must understand the interplay of both systemic interactions and adaptive strategies. They must also understand which factors are internal and external to the system. Well, the writer here has done more than divide the sentence, the original sentence, into several shorter sentences, though he has done that. He's also replaced these long abstract subjects with human beings. So, and you can see that with that change, this passage has become a lot more understandable. In fact, with those two changes, it is now much more understandable. Shorter sentences, human beings as subjects, and more verbs as well. The last thing you can do to write more plainly is to convert long single clause sentences to two clause sentences. Why is this helpful? Why does it make your writing plainer? Well, two clauses require two verbs. So therefore, a sentence with two clauses has more actions. And there are lots of ways you can join clauses with connecting words such as if, unless, because, although, since, when, then, but, and, or so. Those are just a few examples of words you can use. So let's look at two versions of a sentence and see which has a single clause, which has two clauses. Government intervention in fast-changing technologies has led to the distortion of market evolution and interference in new product development. When they intervene in fast-changing technologies, governments distort the market's evolution and interfere with new product development. So you can see that the first sentence here is the one with a single clause, and the second has two clauses. And just that change means that the first sentence has just one verb, has led. And the second one has several verbs, intervene, and distort, and interfere. And so distortion and interference, zombie nouns in the first sentence have become verbs in the second sentence. So right away we have a more active sentence. That second sentence is right away more active. Another change is that government intervention in fast-changing technologies, a rather long and abstract subject, has just become governments in the second one here. And they in the first clause, governments in the second clause in the second sentence. So these changes make for a much more engaging sentence, a sentence that's easier to read. So to sum up then, plain language is clear and precise writing, which avoids jargon and zombie nouns. Zombie nouns deaden your writing. Learn how to avoid them by using strong characters or human beings as subjects and active verbs, and by adopting other strategies such as replacing phrases with clauses. Keep your subject short and avoid including too many words between subject and verb. Seek other ways to reduce words and length of sentences.